Hello and welcome to Connect. I'm your host, Randy Shabilo. On today's show, we'll have Colonel Retired Malcolm Young. He's the Vice Chair of the Remembrance Day Committee here in Saskatoon with the insight into what's going to happen for the in-person gathering November the 11th for the Remembrance Day ceremonies. And as always, we'd like to connect with you.
Follow us on Facebook at Connect YXE. Catch past interviews on our YouTube channel, email us at connectyxe@gmail.com, or leave a message at 306-665-3796.
We have retired Colonel Malcolm Young. He's the Vice Chair of the Remembrance Day Committee here in Saskatoon, taking some time out of his schedule to enlighten us on what's going to be happening in Saskatoon, SaskTel Center. A little bit of background about yourself. Thanks so much for coming down.
Thanks very much, Randy, for having me here today. I appreciate the opportunity to really explain to the citizens of Saskatoon about what we're doing this year for Remembrance Day services on November 11th. We're pleased to say that we're returning to SaskTel Center. And having the in-person service that we've had in the past with some subtle changes, but it will be the service that people have always come to appreciate and make it so well attended, which is important for all veterans and their families.
I want to maybe start with who Malcolm Young is and how he got involved with the service, and a little bit about your family history. You mentioned off camera that there's a long service history with your family. Maybe start there.
Sure. Thanks for that. So my family originally comes from Eastern Canada, Nova Scotia, and many of us migrated west, like has happened over the last 100 years. And from the records and research that we've done as a family, we've determined there's about 18 of us, both on my mom and dad's side, both in Canada predominantly and some in the United States, who have served in the military since about 1900. Some of my Canadian relatives have served in every major conflict throughout the history of our country since 1900, World War I, World War II, Korea, UN missions, NATO missions. I served 32 years, deployed to Afghanistan. I've had cousins who have served, and I have cousins who are currently serving right now. So military service is part of our family tradition. And that in many ways helped to shape me in terms of who I am and my dedication and focus to November 11th. As an example, my grandfather, Alexander Young, had 5 brothers. And of the 6 brothers in that family, including my grandfather, 4 served in the First World War, 3 were killed in service. And so my great-grandmother, Evangeline Young, was a Silver Cross mother 3 times. Wow. Something that we would not even contemplate nowadays, but actually was quite common during the First World War. If you look back at our Canadian history and you look at the casualty rates from the First World War, they're horrendous. Second War, Korea. But we also have to be mindful of the fact that well over 26,000 Canadians have died in service since Korea in terms of the Canadian military. Whether on deployments or in service here in Canada, there has been casualties. And more importantly, just as importantly, there has been wounded. And we must never forget our obligation and responsibility to our wounded, whether it's those wounded with psychological or physical wounds. They deserve our respect, our support, and our understanding that for them to be able to go on their path to resiliency and recovery, it takes time. And so as Canadians, I'm proud to say that I believe both our fellow citizens as well as our government are doing what's necessary to help military members, both past and present, who have suffered injury. But there's always more that can be done. And so November 11th for me personally is a day of reflection based on my own family's military tradition. So I remember my great-uncles Clifford, Harry, and David Young, who died in the First World War. I remember my other great-uncles and uncles who served in the Second World War in Korea, my own father's service of 35 years. And then I remember my service and my time in Afghanistan. So I wear this memorial bracelet and it has the names of 5 young Canadians, all who I knew personally, who served this country and lost their lives during the Afghanistan war. And I will never forget them. And this bracelet is my way of remembering them on a regular basis. And so that's Corporal Shane Keating, Master Corporal Josh Roberts, Corporal Dustin Wasden, Lieutenant Justin Boys, and then Master Corporal Brian Greff. All fine young men from Western Canada, from Saskatchewan, who served their country, but paid the ultimate sacrifice. And so November 11th for me is not just a reflection of my career over 32 years, but the people that I met, the people that I came to appreciate their level of dedication. I was fortunate in my military career to have domestic deployments, both floods and fires, deployments to the Arctic, and in many respects, those domestic deployments are almost as important as my overseas deployment because it gave me an opportunity to serve my fellow Canadians, to see this country from one coast to the other and into the north. And we can be proud of not only the country that we have, but also the folks in military uniform, both past and present, and our first responders who continue to serve this country to make it what it is. I think we can all appreciate that there is the need for both an understanding of the past and a reconciliation in terms of our past as we move forward with our Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit citizens. And there are many, many Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis soldiers, sailors, and airmen that have served this country with great distinction. So just recently, there was a stamp commission for Tommy Prince, the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history, and World War II and Korea veteran. And it's a good example, he is a good example of the stories that we need to continue to tell about all of our veterans, but our Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis veterans specifically.
I think it's important, everything that you've just touched on. I had a brother that was a fighter pilot and an uncle in Burma. Many of us have that connection in some way, shape, or form, and thank you for bringing that up in your own family service. And even friends with the British Commonwealth Training Program that was here.
Yes.
Late Johnny Knight that was killed in North Battleford, trying to do research on him as well. It's important when you talk about Afghanistan, and we have peacekeeping missions, and it sounds fine to say peacekeeping and you think everyone is safe, but those are very hazardous conditions, and thank you for raising that loss of life.
Very, very much so. I think that what Canadians need to understand is that with good intention, our government deploys military personnel around the world in both the peace enforcement missions and peacekeeping missions. But let's be clear, where we are sent, it is a conflict zone. In many cases, it is a war zone. There are two opposing forces or more than two opposing forces. And the reason that Canadians are deployed along with other NATO allies is to try and bring peace to that region. In many cases, the way to bring peace to that region is through use of force, but with specific rules of engagement. And so if you take a look at the former Yugoslavia as an example, the early 1990 rotations and the subsequent rotations or deployments we had until 2014, our soldiers, our sailors and our airmen who were deployed into the former Yugoslavia countries, Bosnia, Croatia, etc., were exposed to things that were horrific, and they paid the price in terms of both physical injury, in terms of incidents with mines, because there's prolific minefields all throughout Eastern Europe, psychological injury in terms of what they saw as a result of ethnic cleansing by various warring factions. And those are the silent injuries or wounds that our soldiers have experienced. And as I said earlier, we have a responsibility to recognize that and to continue to get or ensure that we get them the support that they need. And many of them are able to move forward on their journey to healing. But for some, it's a lifelong journey. And that obligation that we have to them can never falter. And whether that's through support programs through the Veterans Affairs, through the Royal Canadian Legion, or other agencies, because there are also many other private agencies or foundations that provide support to veterans as well. And so in Canada, the singular focus support is not just Veterans Affairs. There are other organizations, as I mentioned, the Legions or the ANAVETS, the Army, Air Force, and Navy's veterans clubs, along with private foundations that work with veterans organizations, both as organizations and individual veterans to get them support. So I raise that point to say two things. There is no peace without, in many of these places, without an armed force who goes in there with a professional approach, a clear understanding of what the mission is, the rules of engagement which allow them to use force selectively, but more importantly, the ability to negotiate with the warring factions to find a common ground, to de-escalate conflict situations and try and establish a peace. And in some ways, those missions into whether it's former Yugoslavia or Africa or South America or Haiti, or the over 57 missions that we have sent Canadians on under the United Nations banner. In many cases, they're small missions, small detachment missions, 5, 10, 20, 30 soldiers, not hundreds of soldiers, small mission detachments that go in. Very much independent, very much isolated, but doing a heck of a job on behalf of our country, the United Nations, and others. And the other thing we can't forget is Canada's contribution to NATO. Many people call it the Cold War. My own father joined the Air Force in 1949, became a fighter pilot, sounds like potentially your family member. And my dad was deployed into France for 3.5 years, and then later we went back to Germany, all under the auspices of NATO. And NATO's deployment into Europe at that time was to be, a guard against Soviet expansion. And when, under the peace dividend, when the Berlin Wall came down and Gorbachev came in and through negotiation with NATO countries, brokered, a peace, I guess, of sorts, what do we see now? The consequences of the expansion by the Soviets into Ukraine, but also the response by NATO countries in terms of provision of materials and training support to help the Ukrainians, in effect, curtail the Soviet invasion, defeat the Soviets. And so when you think about what thousands of Canadians did under the NATO mission, the Cold War, as it's called, as I mentioned, from really the 1950s through to the 1980s, it's really all about recognizing that we send Canadian men and women, whether they're Air Force, Army, or Navy, all around this globe to serve our country, not only to represent our definition of freedom and democracy, but also on behalf of a global community. And we should be mindful of that commitment that they have, of their families, the commitment families, because anytime you deploy, whether it's for a few weeks or years or months, your family is a big part of your ability to support you. In my case, I was in Afghanistan for over a year. So between workup training and my deployment, I was away for over 1.5 years. And so my son and my wife bolstered that responsibility in terms of caring for each other and carrying on with their lives, but knowing that I was in a country that was a conflict zone. And so, our families deserve very much the same level of recognition and appreciation just as much as our Canadian Forces members.
I have to commend the City of Saskatoon with their pilot project for allowing a parking for veterans. And I think in light of all of you and what you've contributed and fought for our land, it seems minuscule to give you that parking space land for that little hour there too you might need. So thank you, and a shout out to the city for doing that. The services, we just have a little bit of time left. Yep. The services are on November 11th at SaskTel Centre, starting at 10 o'clock with the doors open.
Well, actually, slight correction on that. Yep. So yes, we're returning back to SaskTel Centre on Friday, November 11th, which is correct. Doors will open at 9 o'clock. Yep. The televised coverage of the service starts at 10. The march on of the parade starts at 10:30. Yep. And the service will be conducted using the traditional service program that we have. And what we all need to be mindful of is the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And that was the hour, the day, and the month that the armistice was signed in World War I. And that's the same time around the world where there is that act of remembrance. So it's not just Canada, it's not just the Commonwealth countries, it's the interconnectedness of the world around that day. And so yes, we're proud to see that we're returning back to SaskTel Centre. We're fortunate to have compliments being received by 2 World War II veterans, Reg Harrison, who's 100, who's a pilot, bomber pilot in World War II, and then also Bob Atkins, who's 98, who was a member of the Canadian Grenadier Guards and served in the Canadian Armoured Corps in World War II. Both veterans, both wounded, and we're very pleased to be able to honor them and for them to receive compliments from the parade as we do the March Past.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your service, and we look forward to seeing you and thousands of others at the SaskTel Centre November the 11th for what's always been Canada's largest indoor Remembrance Day ceremony. And I want to thank you for taking time today.
Thank you very much, Randy.